Empathy. You may have heard of this word before, but have you ever thought about what it looks like within a marriage context? Well, in this episode, we're going to break down the meaning of empathy and how this unique ability can have a powerful effect in the way you love your spouse. Let's go. Hey friends, welcome to the Marriage Inside Out podcast, where we teach couples how to become mission focused, learning to work together as a team to build a solid foundation for their household. I'm Khalil, and this is my wife, the lady of the house. Yes, you all may know her as AJ, but I call her Adrian. Yes. Let's make some noise. Let's make some noise for the lady of the house.
Happy to be here. Good to chat with you guys today.
Yes. No, we have a very cool episode in line for today. What we're gonna do in this episode is something that we like to call words for your marriage. And this is going to be a continuing series that we do from time to time on the Marriage Inside Out podcast, where we're going to examine a word that has relevance to marriage, and we're going to talk about ways to apply it within our marriages. Mm-hmm. I think, when we often think about what characteristics or what traits are necessary for, your marriage to work, we automatically just jump to, it's all about love. Like, it's all about love. Like, yes, indeed it is. But, what we really want to do is we want to go beneath the surface of just the word love and look at some actual characteristics, some specific characteristics and traits that enable us to love one another within marriage. So we want to dive deeper through these conversations and to think critically. Mm-hmm. And so our first word that we're going to look at is empathy. Yes, empathy. So let's just start off with a basic breakdown of the word empathy.
And empathy, sometimes when that word's brought up, it seems really touchy-feely. It can make people feel uncomfortable. So we want to encourage you guys to just dive into this discussion in order to understand something, you have to start with the definition, right? So empathy itself, it really stems from the Greek word empatheia. And empatheia, the EM portion of that, really means in, right? Like inside. Mm-hmm. And then pathos is that feeling. Mm-hmm. So it's important that when we think of empathy, we're thinking of sharing feelings with one another, really leaning in. And when you think of feeling, again, it can be uncomfortable, but it's important that we understand that in order to empathize, in order to just consider one another in marriage, we need to start with empathy. It's also even used, if many of you guys may enjoy art and art appreciation, right? In art, there's actually a concept that's called empathy specifically, and it's really about one's ability to project his or herself into that project, into whatever that object is that they're displaying. So if you see people walking around art museums and just nodding, right, and just looking at them very thoughtfully, a lot of times they're exhibiting empathy. They're trying to put themselves in the perspective of where that artist was and trying to feel those same experiences as what that artist was displaying.
Yeah, that's really deep. And I think it's good that we're talking about this because, for one, especially for us guys, I believe women do a much better job of this than we often do as men. I mean, sometimes men, we can just be in our own mindsets. Mm-hmm. But yes, this is something that we both as husbands and as wives must be able to exhibit. Just to further break down the meaning of empathy, want to compare it to the word sympathy, because sometimes we can use the two interchangeably, sympathy and empathy, and we might confuse the two of them. We might think that the two of them are the same when indeed they aren't. they are related very much, but they are different. So when we talk about sympathy, sympathy is simply the act of acknowledging someone's pain or their struggle. So it deals mainly with just recognition. So
Yeah.
you're recognizing what someone is going through.
Yeah.
That's what sympathy is. Whereas empathy, on the other hand, is actually feeling someone else's pain and their struggle and their situation. So there is more of an emotional tie within that. So, when you look at an example, sympathy would be someone saying like, oh, I'm sorry that happened.
Yeah.
Or, I'm sorry for your loss. Like, oh, baby, I'm sorry that you're going through that. Or, just, even at me as a husband, I can see you going through something and I can just recognize like, oh yeah, I see you're going through that. But when it comes to empathy, empathy is I'm shedding tears with you.
Yeah.
I'm making your stress now my stress. I'm feeling whatever this pain it is that you're feeling. I'm going through it with you. It's about putting yourself in the midst of someone else's pain or their distress, which I mean, it can be a challenge, but I think it is possible.
Yeah.
And I think, one of the greatest example of empathy that we do have and that we do see is with the example of Christ himself.
Jesus.
There is, one particular story that I think about when it comes to empathy, and it's during the time when a man named Lazarus died. And some of you all might be familiar with this story, but for those who maybe, might not be as familiar, this is actually an event that occurred. It's in John chapter 11, in case you ever want to check it out. But Lazarus was a man who had two sisters. They were friends of Jesus, and there was a time when Lazarus died. And, if you read the story, you see that Jesus went to, the hometown and to the place where Lazarus had died. And, when he got there, Lazarus's sisters, who were named Martha and Mary, they were obviously devastated. They were crying, they were weeping, they were like, Lord, if you would have just been here, he wouldn't have died. But when you read the story, you see that there's a very specific verse that says that Jesus was troubled. Like he was troubled in his heart to see them in their distress. And then we also see that he wept. Yeah. That's where that famous scripture that we love to quote comes from. When it says Jesus wept, he was crying after, seeing the pain of Martha and Mary. And, you can only just imagine, kind of put yourself in the shoes. He allowed himself to feel their pain. He put himself in the midst of their distress. And after he cried, he was then moved with compassion to actually do something about it, which, we see he, supernaturally, was able to make Lazarus rise again. But you see in Jesus that empathy, and then followed by that compassion, which is so key.
Yeah. And research actually shows that empathy is a precursor to compassion. So in order to actually have compassion, to actually move and walk with someone through something they're going through, we have to first understand empathy. And as you guys see on the screen, we're showing you kind of a progression of what it looks like to really grow and mature to the place where you are moved to compassion, just as Jesus was.
Yeah, exactly. And some people might listen to this and be like, well, what does this have to do with empathy in marriage? Like, what does Jesus have to do with that? Well, word says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loves the church. So that's what it has to do with this.
Yes.
It always comes full circle, and I think we can't neglect that. So when it comes to why empathy is important within marriage, I think it really starts with the basic fact that you have two people coming together. You have a man and woman coming together to become one, to become unified. That means that you have two lives coming together. Right. Which also means you have two different backgrounds coming together. You could have two different lived experiences coming together. People who go through two different things on a day-to-day basis, coming together as one. And again, it's not easy. That doesn't just happen.
Right.
It doesn't just happen. I mean, it really requires us to be able to humble ourselves and in order to truly love one another with action. And I think of a verse that says, let us not just love one another with words only, but with action and in truth. And that requires humility to be empathetic towards one another, to have that compassion.
Yeah. And from a practical perspective for us, I mean, there's been so many daily and also more impactful times in our life in marriage that we've really had to show empathy for one another and be moved to compassion. I mean, I know there was a time early on in our relationship, you can talk about it a little.
Yeah, my father passed. Yeah. So back in 2014, my father passed away. And, I remember my wife she was right there with me. We weren't married at the time, but you were right there. She was right there, going through the pain, feeling it with me, and going through the planning of the memorial service and all of that. Like that was empathy.
Yeah. And that empathy doesn't always mean that you have to have gone through the exact same situation, right? It's so important that empathy is leaning in to just understand that perspective. So I'm very much a feeler. So even as Khalil's talking now, like my eyes are welling up because I remember and I feel and I desire to lean in with that compassion to run alongside. And the same thing we do practically during the work weeks. There's times where we have really big projects or even small projects and we feel like we're between a rock and a hard place in terms of getting it done, right? But it'll be like, okay, Khalil, stay up super late in the evening with me if I'm going through a presentation. I don't know where this slide should go or how I should say this, and he'll give me feedback constructively. And yes, he has work tomorrow the next day too, but in empathy and in compassion for the distress in that moment I'm feeling, you slow down enough to consider me, and I just appreciate it.
Yes.
So much.
Same with me. If I'm having something with work that I'm stressing about, you'll say, okay, well let's talk through it. Let's brainstorm some ideas. Let's just get through this together.
Right.
I think another example I think of that can be applied in marriage, and this mainly I think of it in terms of a husband. As a husband, I mean, thinking of wives who, when children come into the picture, I mean, just think about it. As a woman, you're carrying a child for 9 to 10 months. You know what I'm saying? Like that's labor, and then you go through more labor in order to deliver that child. I mean, as a man, I will never know what that feels like.
Yeah.
So I just have the utmost respect for all the women out there, and for my mom, my wife, like just the fact that I will never experience that should drive me to a place of empathy.
Yeah.
And so I need to think of, as a husband, how can I find ways to, help, relieve you of some of the burdens that you may be carrying, not just during the childbearing process, but afterwards too. So, those are just some good practical examples.
Yeah.
So as we get into the tail end of this discussion, how can we be more empathetic towards one another in marriage? Let's give the listeners a few practical tips in which we can do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first starts with examining our own biases that we might have, and bias shouldn't be a scary word. It just means how we see the world, how we were brought up in the world, gaining an understanding of how that affects how we react to the world, right? Exactly. And that starts with a certain level of humility, knowing that we don't have it all figured out. And then also when we're thinking in compassion, we realize that our experiences aren't isolated to one another. It's not just about the individual in marriage like we talked about. It's about working together as a team. And the only way you can truly examine your biases is by asking the Lord, asking him to reveal them to you. If you get angry about something, you can be like, oh, rationally, I was probably angry because of this, but no, Lord, examine my heart. What's that deeper thing that keeps triggering me to be compelled to frustration in this specific scenario? How can I examine how I'm approaching this to continue to grow in you?
Right. No, I think it's good that you say that, because within marriage, sometimes we see ourselves getting just caught in our silos and just in our own worlds, even though we are, under the same roof and supposed to be one, we can still get in just to our selfish and prideful ways and just focusing just on ourselves individually. And so, that's very key. Another thing, is to seek to understand.
Yeah.
To seek to understand one another. And this involves things like being an active listener. It also means observing one another, observing what your spouse is going through, and how they're reacting to that.
Yeah.
You can learn a lot just through observation. I think also asking one another questions,
Yes.
which is something that, sometimes we don't do enough of. Asking one another questions and just being a listener, really internalizing and processing as you're hearing, your spouse share about things, really taking that time to just process it. And then kind of, as we mentioned earlier, to then project yourself into that person's situation.
Yeah.
I think it's good to think about, as your spouse is sharing with you, think about maybe some past experiences in your life where you maybe felt the same way.
Yeah.
And knowing, also, as we mentioned, that it is possible to be empathetic even when you haven't had the same exact experience as another one, as someone else has. And I think that's even the most powerful form of empathy is when you can feel what someone else is going through, even though you haven't gone through the same thing. And I think that is just, empathy in its most powerful state.
Yes.
Yeah. And then another thing is to have empathy, but then be moved with compassion. And we talked earlier about how empathy is the precursor to compassion. And when you think about it, if you think about it on that continuum, empathy is, I feel with you, I feel your suffering, I feel your pain. But then compassion is, I want to actually help relieve you of what you're going through. I want to help relieve you of your burden, relieve you of your pain. And I think that is the ultimate end goal, is to get to that action, moving with compassion towards one another within marriage.
Right.
Yeah.
And the last point is to really understand that you are a team. You are a union. In marriage, we're called to be together, to work with one another, to build one another up, right? That's the beauty. In marriage, you don't have to go through it alone, right? So when you are struggling, it is our responsibility as a spouse to lean in and to listen, and to, when we're tired and weary, right, to push one another towards Christ, but also to show compassion towards one another, to show empathy and be moved towards compassion.
Exactly, because it's always better when you go together, when you go through the trenches together.
Right. Yes.
When you bear one another's burdens, which is what we're supposed to be doing in marriage, especially. So that is empathy, folks. All right, friends. So as we wrap up, our question for the day for you is, what is one quality or trait or characteristic that means a lot to you in your marriage? Or what is a trait or a quality that maybe you and your spouse want to work on within your marriage? Maybe it is patience, maybe it is affection, maybe it is joy, honesty, any of those things. We would love to hear that in the comments below.
Yeah. And of course, thank you guys so much for tuning in. We would love it if you would stay in touch through subscribing. Go ahead and ding that notification bell, and then share this. Share this with friends. Text it to someone that you feel it might be impactful to receive. And then you can, of course, find us at marriageinsideout.com.
Yes, and we will be doing, live virtual trainings. We have one coming up at the end of June, so you can sign up for that on marriageinsideout.com as well. Yes. Well, until next time, everyone, remember, your marriage has a mission, and what the Lord has brought together, let nothing and no one separate. Love God and love one another, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode.